Good afternoon, students and guests. Welcome to the Great Hall. This afternoon, we're pleased to have with us Mr. Jonathan Kozol, author of Death at an Early Age. But before I introduce him, I'd like to give you some background information. Mr. Kozol graduated from Harvard in 1958 with a degree in English. In that same year, he published his first book entitled The Fume of Poppies, a novel that may soon be adapted for screen viewing. Mr. Kozol then studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and lived in Paris for several years before returning to the United States. He then became involved with the black community and the education of black children while teaching in the Boston Public Schools. It was while teaching there that he gathered materials for his book that has caused such a stir among the educators and writers across the nation. Death at an Early Age, which tells of the destruction of the hearts and minds of the children in the Boston Public Schools, won the National Book Award in 1968. Many of us have read this account in one or another of our university courses. Since leaving the Boston School, Mr. Kozol has been involved with working in Roxbury in South Boston with the black community to try and help them establish parent and student-run community schools free of Boston public school control. Mr. Kozol is an interesting man, a man with a purpose. Yes, a man with a message for us all, white or black, and black or white. May I introduce Mr. Jonathan Kozol.
I get so intimidated by the introductions because it makes me feel I've got to be real impressive, big fancy. My wife gave me trouble yesterday about coming to, where is it, Iowa? Yeah, Iowa. I always forget where I am after I've been through the Chicago airport. It's like a time machine. I always feel all mixed up. And she said I should wear my good suit. I have one like pinstripe suit that I got years ago when I was still a good boy. And I usually wear it when I go places that seem threatening or conservative, you know. I won the battle with her, and now I see the audience, I feel relieved. I see lots of nice human-looking people. So I don't feel that was necessary caution. Well, I decided that I wouldn't, for all the big fancy room and everything, I wouldn't come and give a lecture, like a regular lecture, prepared and everything, because it seems sort of contradictory to give a traditional lecture about educational change. You know, I've heard people deliver long lectures on why we shouldn't have the lecture system, so like that. So I wanted to establish my unrespectable credentials. Just the introduction, it mentioned I taught in the Boston school system. It didn't include the manner of my departure, which was that I was fired. I left unwillingly 10 days before the year was up. The charge was curriculum deviation. It always sounds like a sexual offense of some sort. I was just reading a poem that wasn't on the list by a black poet. Now, the way our society works, what Marcuse called repressive tolerance, we've got room for everybody in the system. Within a week after being fired for curriculum deviation, I was offered a job by the federal government for curriculum development. You said, that somebody said if Cleaver had stayed in the United States a few more months and not cut out for Algiers, he probably would have been hired by Time magazine as their urban correspondent or something like that, you know, in-house editor on revolutionary problems or something like that. What I'd like to do, instead of giving that kind of fancy speech, is just to open up to you what I've been wrestling with and groping with in the past 2 years, where I am at now, which is very different from what you will find in my book, which was published 3 or 4 years ago. I've been through an enormous upheaval inside of me, an upheaval which hasn't been easy because it's threatened a lot of the good things like rewards, material rewards, and so forth, and has forced me to put myself in a position which is not comfortable, which is not liberal, which is not safe, and which at times gives me a ball of fear in the pit of my stomach. And this is what I'm writing about and thinking about now, and I'd like to tell it to you. Essentially, this is it. When I started out back in 64, 65, 66, when I was teaching public school in Boston and then later in the suburbs, and when I was writing my book, like many other people, I was operating on a basis which proved just how well educated I was, in that I accepted the legitimacy of the idea of the school itself, and I simply felt it wasn't working. And to elaborate on this a bit, I and many of my colleagues, friends who were writing about schools, you know the books as well as I, the books that came out around that time, we would look at a school system. We would look at Boston or New York or Chicago or even Evanston or Scarsdale or Palo Alto, and we would say, look, here are all these kids, and we're turning them. The school isn't working right because we're turning them into people like Richard Nixon. We're turning them into tradition. We're turning them into people who will obey orders without question. We're turning them into rigid marching soldiers. We're turning them into people who could conceivably someday become willing killers in a war situation. We're turning them into people who don't ask questions. We're turning them into people who can be manipulated to buy Chevrolets. We're turning them into people who can be manipulated to buy Richard Nixon or Hubert Humphrey, whichever it is. We're turning them into people who are predictable, manageable, manipulable. We're not turning them into people like Malcolm X. We're not turning them into people like Thoreau or Gandhi or Tolstoy or St. Francis. You see, we're not turning them into great men. We're turning them into good citizens. And this proves the schools aren't working, you see. This is our complaint. See, and so we'd go to the school board, we'd go to the governor, we'd go to Richard Nixon, and we'd say, "Hey, man, look." This is essentially what my book was saying. We're saying, "Hey, man, look at this. These schools aren't working out right. They're turning out people like you." You see, and this sort of innocence and naivete that we sort of they'll say, "You're right, that's bad. Let's change it. Let's change it. Here's $1 million. Go back and start a different kind of school." You see the naivete of this. And the point that I've come to in the past couple of years, which has been influenced by a lot of talk that I've had mainly with black people. I moved into the black community when I started teaching, and I still live there. That's about 7 years now, and so I've talked with parents a lot, and also from other people I've met. Some of you have heard of Ivan Illich, the great Catholic theologian and radical educator. Illich has been like a father to me, very close. Many different influences, both intellectual and personal, brought me to a point which is very different from before. And this essentially is what it is. It's something like this. School isn't in business to produce Thoreau. School isn't in business to produce Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or Gandhi or St. Francis.
When people like St. Francis come out of the public schools, it's because they didn't work. It's because it didn't work right. So Gandhi is the kind of guy you send to the adjustment counselor, right? He's got these crazy ideas about diet, so forth, funny things. He sits around naked all day in his underpants. See, we send him to the adjustment counselor. William Lloyd Garrison. Remember Garrison? Do people know of him? I guess they should. He was a great hero 100 years ago, you see, more than 100 years ago, a great abolitionist leader. And, you know, if the school gets hold of a little boy like Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison, and he, remember his great act of civil disobedience, just like what's going to be happening in Washington this weekend. It's in a great American tradition, civil disobedience. Garrison stood up in the middle of Boston and burned the Constitution, burned it in full sight of everybody, you see, because he would not acquiesce in obedience to a government which had just grabbed half of Mexico. I guess it's now called Texas, and which was also endorsing, empowering slavery, enforcing the return of fugitive slaves. And if the school gets hold of somebody like Garrison, see, what they do is they look at him and they say, well, first of all, they accuse him of destructive criticism, negative criticism. This is the first thing. There's the primary offense in public school is to make a negative criticism but not to make a positive suggestion, right? Like with the little kids in the grade school, a little boy who can't stand the Scott Forsman reader, little goofy reader. What are they called? Streets and Roads. Do you know those books? Are any of you teachers? Yes, some must be, or some of you went to school, I guess. The Streets and Roads. Remember all those books? There was a new version, New Streets and Roads. And when I taught in Boston, we had the super modern edition, which was more streets and roads, because on and on, those roads go on forever. You can't get out of them. And, you get somebody a little boy who says, this is so boring, to the teacher, and the teacher says, a lot of people worked a long time to write that book for us. That's a lot of people did a lot of work to write these stories for us, Oscar, and to print these pictures and to publish this book and to bind the book and everything like this. And and then she says, it's all very well for you to criticize this book without offering us a better one. See, as if little Oscar was going to go out, as if he would want to go out and offer a better one. You see, the point is that he doesn't want anything like it. But if the school gets hold of somebody like Garrison, that's exactly what we do with him. You see, Garrison stands there with the Constitution in his hand, and and he burns it, and the teacher looks at him. The teacher marches towards him. You know the way teachers do it when you've done bad in school? They always... My teacher always used to go like that with her arms, come at me, march towards me, and always, the teachers that would frighten me always had long, pointy nails, long, pointy fingernails, and I had a teacher in the 4th grade who had blue-dyed hair. I never know how you could get it blue. I remember that. It was blue hair. It was like Superman's girlfriend. She had blue hair too. And anyway, the teacher comes towards you and she comes to Garrison and she says, like, a lot of people worked a long time to write that piece of paper, William Lloyd. They talk down to the child. It says, it's all very well for you to burn that piece of paper. But it's all very well to do that. The hard thing is to offer something better, you see. And when Garrison, so if he complies, if he gives in, if the little boy repents and says, yes, I did bad, then we give him good marks for deportment and citizenship and so forth. But if he resists, if he won't comply, if we can't break him down, we send him to the adjustment counselor, something like that. And if that doesn't work, we send him in, the adjustment counselor refers him to counselor or to a psychiatrist for something which the medical profession still, for some reason or other, calls therapy. And then, if that doesn't work, we send him to jail or prison. If that doesn't work, we try to kill him. We hang him in the public square. If we can't kill him and he lives for about 20 years and he writes a few good books and makes a few more speeches and burns a few more sacred documents in the public squares, then we have one final method for dealing with the residue of danger that he represents. And we do it like this. We wait until he's dead and the last prayer has been pronounced upon his coffin being lowered into the ground, and the mourners mill off from the gravesite. And then what we do is we go back to school and we build a brand new, we go back to town, you see, we build a brand new beautiful school and we name it for him. You see, this is the final and unfailing way by which society deals with negative attitudes and ill-adjusted children. You see. The point I'm trying to make is that it's naive to expect anything different. Schooling exists for this purpose. Schooling is, above all other functions, all other roles, an indoctrinational vehicle. It is an instrument for creating a homogenized population. Now, the thing that's bitter about this, of course, is that in schools of education, we talk about it. We talk about it often. There's a word for it, socialization, right? You know that word, socializing children. Well, it sounds like a nice word. It sounds like sort of a soft, friendly word. But what it really is this, if we're talking about Russia, we call it brainwashing, indoctrination. Nations we don't like, it's brainwashing. If it's our nation, it's socialization. And we talk about it in schools of education all the time, but for some reason we never tell children about it, you see. We never let them in on why they're really in school. The first priority of public school, above all others, is to guarantee a stable, homogenized, reasonably uniform population that can be guaranteed to make roughly the same kinds of choices and decisions as the population, as the generation that came before. The primary role is not to produce somebody like Thoreau or William Lloyd Garrison, but to produce a nation of obedient voters, of manageable producers, manipulable consumers, and, in case of war, willing killers. And this is the role the schools have assumed, and this is the role they have accepted, and this is the role they have largely fulfilled. And their peripheral functions, it's true, they do other things as well. In addition to indoctrinating children, schools also serve a custodial role, which is probably their second most important function, a custodial function being essentially, babysitting, Illich has described it as a low-cost, tax-supported house arrest. So keeping kids essentially off the political market, out of politics, out of work, out of trouble, for the 12 years in which they have the highest likelihood of changing things. The greatest likelihood of changing things. We don't let them out until we know that they have been properly treated. Cured, as it were, cured of conscience, cured of anger, cured of ecstasy, cured of ethics, cured of rage. And when they have been well treated and cured and processed, and those 12 years are complete, we hand them a piece of paper, their graduation certificate, which is a guarantee that they may be allowed out into society. And this really is the third major function of public school, along with indoctrination and custodial function, is credentializing people. Once they've sat it out, once they've stuck it out, once they've sat there for 12 years in a row, proving, if nothing else, no matter what they've learned or haven't learned, proving that they are willing to sit still for 12 years, we give them a degree. Essentially, the degree, that the certificate of graduation is the proof of credentialized moral impotence. It is a proof that we have sat still long enough and forfeited all our drives and all our needs and all our wishes sufficiently long so that now we can be trusted. And the longer we sit it out, the better the rewards we get. If we sit it out for 12 years, we will be allowed a certain degree of power. If we sit it out for 16 years, still more. If we sit it out for 20 years, like a doctor, a lawyer, or something like that, we get the biggest prizes of all. And then maybe fourth place, if we ever get there, we do something called so-called basic skills. We teach reading and writing and arithmetic, if we have time. And maybe in fifth place, only in the strangest schools, and only in the part of the most radical teachers, and only in the strangest situations do we occasionally do something called inquiry, questioning, provocation, thinking, the kind of thing which Thoreau might have considered to be the sole function of education, and the sort of thing that a totalitarian nation would not do at all. And we occasionally get there by accident, but very seldom. Now, the reason that I've tried to schematize these priorities the way I have, 4 major priorities of the schools in this way, is because it seems to me essential that we have a comprehension, a clear, logical, unclouded vision of what the school is really doing in order to understand the need for the kind of rebellion which is now beginning in this country. And before speaking of the rebellion, it seems to me it would be worthwhile for me to try to pinpoint in very specific ways, so you know exactly what I mean, the nature of indoctrination, exactly what kind of thing I'm talking about. The school, when we say indoctrination, I assume, my hunch is that most of the kids in this audience and the teachers and the older people assume I mean something like politics. I should think that would be what comes to mind, political indoctrination, like the Pledge of Allegiance and stuff like that. Well, that's only part of it, and it's a really rather small part of it. It's the most obvious part, so it's worth talking about it perhaps for a moment. But I'm only going to, I have this tendency, terrible, disorganized tendency to just go on and on with whatever thing most fascinates me. So I try to cut it off very quick in about 5 minutes. And I'm trying to make this organized if I can, but it's very hard for me to do it because when I was in school, I was so I was so oppressed by the terrible, awful obsession school has with organizing things and outlining. You know, so I tend to react against it by being hopelessly obscure and wandering all over the place. But because I used to, whenever we started studying anything in school, the first thing we did before anything else was to do an outline. We were always outlining things, like as if it didn't matter what it was. You'd have all these Roman numerals and everything. Start out. It didn't matter what the substance was. You see, so you could outline love. See, you could outline hate, you could outline, I'm sure public schools, if you gave them a chance, could outline sex, you know. And it was all, like, before anything else, you'd learn one big Roman numeral, then a little number, then a letter A, something, then a little A, then little letters. You have to get littler and littler, think of different things, X or something, and it didn't matter what it was. You could have been outlining the main ideas of medieval art or painting, you know, in northern Italy, or you could have been outlining noodles or spaghetti. It wouldn't have mattered lima beans. If you did it orderly, you'd get your rewards and your prizes. So I'm trying not to do that today. I'm trying to be as obscure as possible. I'm afraid I'm succeeding. Anyway. Now, I described the 4 main points. I'm going to be organized for a moment. And now I'm speaking about indoctrination. And what I'd like to do is describe 2 different kinds of indoctrination. One, the kind you really think of right off the bat, which is chauvinism, and the other something else. Okay. Chauvinistic kind of education is this sort of thing. It's fairly obvious, the sort of thing that radicals talk about too much because it's too easy to pinpoint. We study nations grabbing land, right? If the Russians do it, it's Soviet aggression. If the British do it, or the French do it, or the Belgians do it, it's imperialism. The United States does it, it's manifest destiny. Remember that? Manifest destiny. We go eternally westward, the drive west. And we go all the way from New England to all the way to the wilds of Iowa, and then further all the way to the California coast, and then we wait half a century and keep right on across the Pacific, right, till we can take care of the people in Cambodia and Laos and Vietnam too. Now this is fairly obvious kind of thing. The flag salute every morning. The notion that children I don't know why I'm never writing when I lecture, but I always have to have that pen in my hand for some reason. When the kids have this feeling that when the United States deals with foreign countries, like when we go to Latin America, it's always for some kind of good thing, like we're going there to bring why do we go to Latin America? We go there to bring powdered milk, I guess, to starving children, something like that, or else to bring the word of Christ to the heathen, something of that sort. The heathen is such a funny word, isn't it? The heathen. That always sounds so much more interesting than the missionaries. They sound nicer, heathen. And there we're going there for these reasons. Nobody ever tells the children that the only reason we go to foreign nations is to make money. That's it. We go there to make money, or else to have a missile base, or a nuclear submarine base, or another branch of the Chase Manhattan Bank, or another Gulf station, or something, another Howard Johnson's, more to add to the 28 flavors, add papaya, something new. This is why we go to foreign nations. We go to make money. It's not necessarily evil, but there's a little cynicism in it, and we never tell this to children. This is the thing. Okay. This, I think, is fairly obvious. This part of the scene, I think, is obvious. Straight flag waving. It's lies. It's dishonest. What we ought to do is tell children that the United States, just like the Soviet Union and just like Great Britain and just like China and just like Germany, has a lot of good and a lot of rotten evil in it, and that there's a lot of both, and that our lives are going to be a continual battle between the two, and that nobody can go forward in life and make a simple demarcation between good on the side of some crazy amorphous thing known as free enterprise, or that fascinating commodity known as the free world, which for some reason includes Greece, fascist Spain, Formosa, the Union of South Africa, fascist Brazil, so forth, and on the other hand, that evil half or two-thirds of the world, which is red, communist world. This is the obvious part of it. Okay. And I assume that many people here, at least due to the force of events in the past few years, have this kind of bubble has been burst somewhat just by events. It's hard to read about Lieutenant Calley and see what happened in My Lai and all over Vietnam, because you know very well that's the one out of 1,000 stories that we heard about. The others we just didn't hear about. The others didn't get into the press. It's hard to hear about that and go through the same old rituals without a great deal of uneasiness. But I think the much more important thing is the other kind of indoctrination, and this is what I'm going to talk about for the rest of the time. Then I'll open it up so you can fire questions at me. If I talk too long, interrupt me. I don't mind that if you have to. Patriotism is like the top part of the iceberg, but as Hemingway told us, 4/5 of the iceberg is underwater, and the part that's underwater is the part I'm going to talk about now. It isn't so much explicit chauvinism, selling the flag, selling anti-communism, selling free enterprise. It isn't this so much which seems to me to be dangerous, because this is something which we can easily study and understand. What to me is much more important is the part that lies underneath it, which has much less to do with specific issues and much more to do with what I call the demolition of the child's instinct for justice. As simple as that. The containment, the muting, the silencing, the calming down, the tamping down, the calming in, like bringing the kids all into a kind of quiet place in the middle where they don't feel there's anything to be upset about. This is what I want to talk about, because it's my belief, and I think current events are going to prove this, that we are now we are so well trained to mute our feelings, to suppress our reactions, to silence our anger, to question our own voice of ethics inside of ourselves, each one of us, that we can almost hear anything now. We can get almost any information. We can read about My Lai. We can read about defoliation of the fields of Vietnam. We can read about racism in Boston and New York. You can read books like mine. 1 million kids have read books like mine. You see, we can read this stuff, and we can still go on with our ordinary lives with nothing changed because school has taught us how to handle guilt. And this is the real heart of indoctrination, so far as I'm concerned. And this is what I want to talk about. School teaches us how to handle a crisis of conscience. School protects us against the danger of getting upset and going home and crying after we read an upsetting book. School teaches us how to read Malcolm's autobiography, how to read Man-Child and the Promised Land, how to read the writings of all these black writers whom you've probably read in your Negro history seminars and problems of democracy, how to read books like my own, tuck it away, call it another interesting book on a serious issue, and go on with our ordinary lives. And it's upon this vehicle that the perpetuation of the American way of life depends. This is what I want to talk about. There are a lot of ways in which it happens. It happens, number one, by school training us to be suspicious of ethical people. In the early years on, kids learn that there's something a little bit odd and screwy and unreliable about a child who makes statements of simple justice or injustice. School gets very impatient with a kid who makes that kind of statement. We have a preference for what we call a regular fellow. You know that phrase? The regular fellow, a good fellow, a good boy who doesn't cause trouble. What school likes is that guy. The guy who gets upset, the kid who cries, the kid who says, this is wrong, we should do something about it right now. That kid is dangerous, and that kid is the one we send to the adjustment counselor, or else the psychiatrist, or something of that.
To make a strong statement of denunciation is equivalent to treason in the public schools. A child who stands up and says, I think that racism is evil. I think that the war is evil. I think that it is evil that black children in America, which is the case, as I will illustrate in a moment, have 2 or 3 times the chance of being born dead as white people because of non-existent medical treatment in the ghettos of this country. I think that that is evil. And a kid who says that, teacher immediately goes to work on him, just like with Garrison, the way I said before. It says, well now, you know, Tommy, it's very easy for you to criticize and break down what other people have done and said, but it's not, the hard thing is to offer something better. You see, as if that child could right on the spot go out and start his own hospital, this kind of thing. We make it treasonable to condemn any institution which we cannot immediately replace, knowing very well ahead of time that these children cannot replace any of the institutions that we're describing, and furthermore that some of them do not even merit replacement. You see, this is the secret load in that kind of assumption. When the teacher says to the child, if you don't like this, offer something better. You see, often what the teacher is doing is she's failing to recognize that what the child is objecting to is not this particular variation of the thing, but the thing itself. You see, if you don't like this war, show us a better one. This is the school's answer to. When the child isn't objecting to this war, he is objecting to the idea of illegal war in general. That's the point. Okay, another example of this sort, I'm just trying to list a lot of things which I hope will strike home with some of you, is the school's bias against extremes. School does not like extreme viewpoints of any kind. Now, a consequence of this is that every polarity, every confrontation, every true opposition must be absorbed and brought into a kind of graceful place in the middle where there's nothing to be angry about. Little boy, classic conversation in class, free discussion period. Little boy says, I think that segregation is bad. All right. Little girl over here says, well, I think that people ought to have the right to rent their homes to anyone they want. You know, open housing argument. The teacher, the classic way of dealing with this, she refuses to admit that they are in real disagreement, that they ought to be, because this kid over here is defending the interests of the landlord. This kid over here is defending the interest of justice. There are poor people, are people who have been persecuted. Teacher will not admit that there is a real opposition here. This is what happens. All right, she says. I'll stick with my little same name. Oscar has said that segregation is evil. You see, all right. Susan says that everybody has a right to rent to anyone they want. You see, she says, well, there may be a little truth on both sides of this issue. She says, let's see if we can't find a third position, somewhere in the middle. You see. And then she will steer the children to a gradual place in the center. In one of our history books, one I quoted in my book, if I remember right, when talking about the Civil War, it said, at the end of the whole, when the Civil War was over, the last thing said, nobody can say the North was right or that the Southern cause was better. Isn't that amazing? Just imagine that, an American textbook. See, no one can say the North was right or that the Southern cause was better, for all of us in our America have the right to our beliefs. What a wonderful feeling. There's nothing worth fighting about. Truth is like a little fat man who sits in the middle. Truth by his nature prefers the middle. The truth in the Civil War was somewhere equidistant between Washington and Montgomery. You see, there's a very important thing to put into children's minds. You see, it would be perfectly honest if a teacher were to say to kids, look, kids, we're going to have an easier time here today if you'll just cut into your integrity a little and compromise. You know, she just said, compromise is useful and convenient. Let's compromise. Let's pretend you don't really believe those things you do. But see, it's never done like that. Instead, the implication is that truth by its nature lives in the middle, that there is something essentially false, fallacious about a real disagreement between opposing sides. And this, of course, is an instrument, an ideology which serves the interests of people who have power, because essentially what we're saying is, what we're telling children in school is, there's nothing to fight about. There's no real difference between oppressor and oppressed. There's no real difference between, there's no real disagreement between the tenant of a terrible rat-infested slum apartment in the heart of Harlem and the rich guy outside in the suburbs who owns the building. If we just talk long enough, we'll find that none of us are in real disagreement. Instead of, we just talk. Confrontation then becomes an intellectual mistake, right? Reasonable people understand that we can talk it out. It's an aberration, it's mental illness to think that we are opposed to one another. But in fact, in many cases, we are opposed to one another. The poor woman in the slum is not on the same side as the rich man who owns her apartment. The poor campesino down in Venezuela or Brazil or Chile or Colombia who walks up and down the hill to the loading boats loading bananas for the USA and gets paid for that $80, $100, $120 in a year is not on the same side as the guy who owns the United Fruit Company, you see. But the idea of the mandatory consensus that there's something wrong with an opposition is deeply built into the public schooling system in this country. Another ritual of this sort is the myth, what I call the myth of progress. That what we tend to do is we tell kids that even when you learn about something bad and painful where people are suffering and there's pain and woe and trouble and death, what we sort of do is we say, if you just close your eyes and don't look for a while, it gets better. Sort of inevitable progress. This feeling that we get it sort of all through history, that every chapter of the history book in the little grade, younger grades, every chapter of the history book sort of is an improvement over the one before. Things are always getting better. Things improve without us. It starts way back there with the Egyptians. Isn't that where world history usually starts? The Fertile Crescent, with the Egyptians walking sideways, like the funny way they walk. There's things, what do you call them? Friezes or something like that. Walking sideways across the world with their eye misplaced halfway across their head, around there, sort of near their ear. Things were very awkward and primitive in those days. And then you get up a little level, you improve, and you get up to the Assyrians or something like that, because they invented the wheel or something. And then, that isn't true, I'm just thinking of silly examples. And then you get up a little further, the Israelites, one God. That was a big innovation, one God. And then you get up to the Christians, who not only had one God, but also had the right God, more important, right? The Jews didn't know that. One God, they had the right God. You see, keep going. I'm Jewish, so I have to get my thing in there. And anyway, and then, but this feeling that everything was always getting better. And then Greeks, I guess they'd been around sooner. I'm getting a little out of order. But, then like the age of Pericles and so forth, and then the Roman Empire, and then Constantine, great moment when Constantine became a Christian. Things were really humming along then. And then things go into abeyance for a little while, a sort of a quiet period of 1,000 years called the Dark Ages, something like that. And then things get cooking again with the Renaissance and all the people running around painting church frescoes and all those gifted people suddenly in Rome and all those wonderful, glittering, brilliant, rich popes. And then wonderful, it's another important step forward where an English king invents divorce, right? Calls that the Reformation and so forth. We get 3 or 4 more religions and so forth. And then we discover the United States, America, and then it becomes the United States. And then we have slavery, but then we end slavery. And then we have the Hun, and we beat the Hun. And the Hun gets turned into the Nazi, and we beat the Nazi. And then the Nazi becomes our ally, so we go and beat the Russians, and so forth. And there's this feeling that everything's getting better all the time. This is the point. So I guess that was one of my classic deviations from the outline. Anyway, back to 2 sub b x or something. Point is that kids get this feeling that everything's getting better all the time without them anyway. And as long as we have this feeling, there's no need for any of us to stick out our neck. This is the real point. If things are improving all the time, if, civil rights is like sort of civil rights become sort of like an inevitable, like one of those Boeing aircraft taking off. It's always rising. It's getting up and up and up. If we just don't hear about it for a while, it must be better. This is the feeling we get. So I often like to give a, kind of painful example of this. A lot of people I know who used to be in the civil rights movement now live out. They're people who were active in civil rights in 1964, 65, and now they've moved out to the suburbs. And the funny thing that goes on nowadays, which is like, I call it ideological promiscuity, where people keep shifting movements. It's this year we're into civil rights, and next year we're into pollution, and the 3rd year we're into women's lib, and then the 4th year, not there's anything wrong with this, any one of these. I have to defend myself against the angry women. But the point is that we keep shifting gears. Civil rights, all right, that gets boring. We write a few books, a few bestsellers, a few talk shows. Bring out a few handsome Negroes, put them on the Dick Cavett show, switch gears, time for pollution next year, new issue, new thing, new special issue of Time magazine, you see. Then we discover the Mexican American, you see. Then we discover the American Indian. See, it's like the search for new oppressed minorities. We keep shifting gears. Then we discover that we are oppressed, which is the most wonderful discovery of all, because then we don't have to worry about anyone else. Like when the real apocalyptic moment of American defeat, I think, is the moment when the millionaire child, of David Rockefeller, decides that he was oppressed because he was forced to go to Groton and Harvard, and that he didn't go to a school like Summerhill, and even more when his wife discovers that she was oppressed because she couldn't go down to Wall Street, that she had to stay at home and watch and watch TV. And I think the point of this is that the only reason we're able to shift gears like this and keep moving from thing to thing to thing, we keep going. You watch next year, it'll be something else. This year it's wheat germ, a whole earth catalog. Have any of you ever heard of that? This year it's sort of do your own thing, country communes, and everybody be beautiful in the country and make love in the bushes. And we keep shifting gears. And the reason we're able to do this is because we are persuaded that if we don't hear about something, it's probably gotten better. So I meet people that I used to know when we were marching years ago in the movement, and that now many of them are people who cashed in on the movement, made money out of it by becoming research. The way you really cash in is when you become a research sociologist, and then you teach courses on the disadvantaged child. So what you do is you trade in your years of picketing and marching and jailing and struggling for respectability. And when you do that, you move and you get a house out in the country, and then you become acceptable to the traditional society. I have a lot of friends who have done this, and I go out and visit them now, and they'll look at me and they'll say, whatever happened to that? They'll remember some child we used to work with, and they'll say, whatever happened to that little skinny kid? Or what was the name of that little skinny kid we used to know? They'll remember some black kid that we used to work with, and they'll say, what was his name? Something like that. And the way they ask it, it's clear that what they're really doing is soliciting evidence that he's better. Do you understand what I mean? They want me to provide them with the information to convince them that it's gotten better while they weren't looking, you see. Silence and the passage of 2 years are evidence that children are not dying. You see, this is sort of the myth of progress. You don't hear, nobody burns down a city. You don't see it on TV. It must have gotten better. So they'll say, you know, what was the name of that skinny little kid we used to see around the street all the time? And I'll say to them, his name was Michael. His name is still Michael. You know, he was skinny then. He is skinny today. You're right that he was hungry. He is hungry now. Nothing has changed. You see, this thing. When I say this, it's as if I'm committing cultural treason. You see, as if it's treasonable not to say that things have gotten better. Of course, they haven't gotten better. If we're talking about northern cities, there are more children in segregated schools now than there were by far, than there were in 1964 when the Supreme Court decreed segregated schooling to be unequal. There are more children dying of untreated illness. Medical care for poor black people is far worse today than it was 10 years ago. And malnutrition and starvation have increased somewhat since the Senate held its hearings to look into the issue. This is a myth that most of us live with. It's a very consoling myth, very easy myth, be comfortable. Then, I think in a way one of the classic myths that school purveys to children is what I call the myth of impotence. I hate to stratify things like this. I see some people taking notes, and I hope you won't sort of put this into 25 major points and subdivisions and things like that. But I think I'm not going to. I don't have time to describe all the kinds of indoctrinational things that happen in school, but I think the impotence myth is a very important one because it comes very close to many of us, to me and I think to many of you. Essentially what school does in terms of this is that it sort of trains children when they're very young, and it keeps on right through junior high and high school and college. It sort of trains you to think that although you might be efficient in terms of looking after your own interests and getting the things that you want in life or the things that you need, and although you might be technologically efficient and that you might be able to manipulate gadgets and make things work, program computers, do complicated geometry or something like that. I guess that's not so complicated. Whatever it is, so although it gives you a sense of technological competence, it gives you a feeling of ethical impotence, futility, as though there's nothing you can do. There's really nothing you can do about it. And it enacts this in lots of ways. It teaches us, for example, a classic ritual of impotence that takes place in public school is what I always call the letter to the congressman, the friendly letter to our friendly congressman, where the children discover an issue that's important, that's upsetting, and they sit down and the teacher shows them they're going to write a letter to the Congressman Magoo in Washington to ask him to fix it, please. And in our case, it would be Congressman Hicks. Mrs. Hicks is our congressman. So she's a racist woman who was a school committee chairman in Boston some years ago. Now she's gone up in life. She's congresswoman now. And Mrs. Hicks says, so that you'd have the little black children in Roxbury, which is her district, sitting down there and writing letters to Mrs. Hicks, the teacher dictating how to do the margins and everything, because that's all get very ritualized. Write a letter to Mrs. Hicks on how to, on saying, dear Mrs. Hicks, we live in a ghetto, and we're poor, et cetera, et cetera. Sure, it wouldn't be exactly like that, things are hard, et cetera. Would you please fix this? Would you do something about it, Mrs. Hicks? And then they wait a few weeks and they get back a reply, which is usually a form letter prepared by her legislative assistant. And the reply is sort of like, it's a non-answer to a non-request. The whole thing is falsified, of course. They write to her about segregation, you see, and she replies and says, in fact, you see, she's already made her decision. She's already voted against it. That's the point that matters. She doesn't care about their vote. She doesn't need them. All she needs is the support of the people who pay the money to finance her next campaign. And it's not those poor black children. But she replies to them, "Dear children, this is very nice of you to write to me. I'm always glad to hear from my constituents. And this is a very important issue. Segregation is indeed a grievous matter, tragic issue. We all remember Dr. King, whom we revered so much. Of course, 5 years ago, when he was alive, Mrs. Hicks called King a dangerous racist and imputed arson to his followers in Boston. She hated him. But you know, now she'd say, it's very sad that he died, of course, most unfortunate, and we're all working on this issue, and House Bill number 21605 has been sent in, and there's going to be a study committee to discuss segregation next year. 2 years from now, the President's Council on Children and Youth will discuss this matter, et cetera, et cetera. And then she winds up the letter saying, it's extremely important that children like you care about this issue. We're all working hard on it, but probably you're doing the most important thing of all by writing me a letter, you see. And that's probably the truth, bitterly, you see. No one's doing anything more effective. And so the children write a non-letter, they get a non-reply, they read it, they feel a kind of funny, empty feeling as if that's sort of an answer. They sort of did something, but then it doesn't quite seem like they did anything in a way. And they think about it for a while, and nothing changes, and then they shift gears and they go on and write a letter about pollution next year, you see. And out of this comes this sense of futility, that there's really nothing you can do, this sort of sense of hopelessness, of impotence. There's nothing you can really do to make it different, you see. Of course, there are a lot of things you really could do, but the children never know this. Now, I'd like to try to illustrate what I mean by describing a conversation I had with some kids at a high school a couple of months ago. And I'm going to read you something, which is some manuscript that's now in progress that I'm working on. I just think it illustrates this dramatically. I hope you don't mind being exploited to hear my work, as it's is not yet polished. But it's just a description of something that happened to me a couple of months ago, and I've never forgotten this. I live in Boston, the ghetto, but I go out often to visit kids in the rich suburbs all around our city, with a lot of very wealthy white suburbs all around there. And this is a scene from that. It's 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon. We are sitting in a small, well-furnished room, soft lamps, warm carpets, Paris posters on the walls. It's 2 o'clock at one of the most modern, well-supported, and academically prestigious senior high schools in the United States. This happens to be a suburban Newton High School, one of the fancy schools in the country. And it's the kind of school, you know, where they have little fancy seminar rooms and things like this. Okay. In front of me are a dozen of the children who have been here for 4 years and will 3 months from now be going on to college. Their fathers are bankers, architects, attorneys, and physicians. This is a town that has the highest per capita earning in America. The high average income is like $35,000, something like that. Fathers are bankers, architects, attorneys, and physicians. They travel with their families to Madrid and Paris, San Juan, Sao Paulo, Rio de Janeiro, you know, summer adventures. They fly to Switzerland for Christmas, hitchhike to Colorado, spend summers working in Nebraska or Vancouver. They read Kant, Spinoza, Hegel, Tolkien, Robert Lowell, build their own cyclotron, get Math 800 on their college boards, turn down admission to Harvard, Yale, and Vassar, prefer to go to Oberlin or Berkeley, Reed, or Bennington. Yeah, sort of very chic, very effective, very successful kiddies. Okay. I look at them. Who are they? They are the skilled and brilliant, sleek and slender, well-fed, strong and understated children of the men who govern, possess, design, appropriate, invest in, and develop, knock down, build up, export from, import into, fly out of, build up into and around between 1/2 in 2/3 of the earth we live on. They can program computers, hitch to Palo Alto, drive to Putney, phone long distance to Geneva, visit their friends in Venezuela, thumb their nose at Yale and Harvard, build perfect scale model versions of the Eniwetok H-bomb, mold steel medallions, sew flags on the rear end of their blue jeans, make love with each other in the meadows, and arrange their own abortions if they need to in Manhattan or in Copenhagen. But there's nothing that they can do about poor people. They inherit the earth, but somehow not their soul. Now this is the crazy phenomenon, that I see with these kids. I'd like to describe one of these young girls. Now I bet you've seen her everywhere. She must be somebody here, because she's everywhere. She sits there, very typical earnest kid. She sits there, gentle and reflective, earnest, well-intending, a thoughtful girl, hands wrought up in anguish. You know the way kids, when they talk, will sort of go like this with their hands? I don't know why girls do that a lot. And like that game you play when you're a child about the spider, And they said she sits there, hands wrought up in anguish to express her sense of curious frustration. And this is what she says. She says, I mean, like, it always starts that way, like to start. She says, I mean, like, we know there's a lot of stuff that's probably not fair and democratic in this country, and like race, and like the system's just not right. We know that stuff. We know it isn't fair, but we can't hassle with it now. That's a very familiar word. We can't hassle with it now. It's just too hard. It's just too much for us. There's just too much to understand. Her words, it's in my writing, so gentle, earnest, and aspiring, drift for a moment in the quiet space of air and lamplight. There is real sadness there, the bleeding away of something good and deep and genuine in her eyes and those of her friends around her as she speaks these arduous and jargon-interrupted words. Her hands, still twisted on the floor beside her now, symbolic of her twisted and defeated aspirations, as her words drift slowly upward. Then somebody else in the room who's nearby on the floor, a plump girl with a face somehow benign and bovine, straightforward, adds on in a nice voice too, and earnest also, like a soft sound out of the kindergarten hours, or out of the hours of that first grade teacher with the polished nails and blue-dyed hair. She says, that voice that rocked you back and forth with reassurance, she says, well, I think the very least that we can do is care. You see, that word care. The two ideas are like the plain song of our self-defeat. First, we recognize our sense of ethical ineptitude. Then we attempt to still our sense of unrest with the notion of an innocuous but well-remembered phrase. What is, we say, well, we can care, we can be concerned. I don't want to read on with the rest of it, but the point is, obviously, if those kids wanted, there's zillions of things that they could do. The children in America are extremely powerful. The great triumph of school is that it teaches us that we're not. It tells us that we're not. There's nothing that we can do. Kids have incredible power in this country if they only could find out that they have it. For example, just to give you one example, schools, public schools in America, there are a lot of things they could do without. We know very well. They could do without ditto mimeograph machines. They could do without overhead projectors. They could do without principals in many cases. Any principal here, of course, you're an exception. But, many cases they could do without principals. They certainly could damn well do without school boards. They don't need school boards at all, And they could do without Scott Forsman, and they could do without Dick and Jane. And in many cases, when kids are really cooking along at a certain age, they could do without teachers. But there's one thing schools cannot do without. They cannot do without children, right? Children are the indispensable lifeblood of a public school. Without children, there ain't nothing. Teachers can't teach each other. If there are no children there, principals don't have anybody to scold, right? There's no one to send to the adjustment counselor. There's no one to test. There's no one to make records on. There's no one to measure. There's no one to humiliate. There's no one to reward. There's no one to give gold stars to, you see. And the point, the thing is, kids don't know this. They don't understand what kind of power they have. The moment that the kids in Darien and Scarsdale and Evanston, Illinois, and Palo Alto, California, and all these rich suburbs, and there must be some here, but I don't know the local names. Whenever the kids in the local neighborhoods in this country begin to understand that theirs is the indispensable lifeblood of the schooling system, that without them there are no schools, it will be the end of a way of life in the United States, and it will mean the crumbling of those building blocks that we have lived beneath. And kids do not understand the power that they have. There are so many things that they could do. 1,000 kids, you see, we always see the situation of kids, 1,000, 2,000, nice kids, good kids, kids who are idealistic, 14, 15-year-old kids. They're sitting around, they're saying, isn't it terrible? Black people don't have doctors. They can't see a doctor. Jesus, what does that mean? So something like a quarter of the black children in America a couple of years ago were delivered even without an obstetrician present. Imagine what that means, without a midwife or an obstetrician present. So they say, Jesus, isn't that terrible? Isn't that terrible? They build up, they do their research, they have their class discussion, they do all their little things, they do their reference work. And what is the consummation, the climax of their labor? The climax of their labor is to be concerned. You see, they say, we are very concerned, and they write a term paper on it, and damn it, they even get credit for the term paper, which helps to increase the difference, but the distance between them and that black kid they're worried about, you see. They get credit for it, but there's nothing they do. The day, you see, when 1,000 kids in Evanston, Illinois refuse to accept private medical treatment, refuse to go to a private physician, and insist that their father and their mother take them into the clinic that serves the people in the north side of Chicago. You see, that's the beginning of a medical revolution in this country. The day that the kids in those rich suburban white high schools determine that they will not go on from a rich man's high school to a rich man's college to pick up a rich man's credentials to get a rich man's prize, as long as kids who are every bit their equal have been denied that chance, that is the end of a way of life within this country. Imagine what it would mean if you opened the paper someday, if someone opened up the New York Times one day and read that 100 children in New Rochelle, New York, or Scarsdale, I don't know why I always think of Scarsdale. 100 kids in Scarsdale were fasting. They were fasting for 10 days. This is a long time. It probably wouldn't kill them. 10 days, yeah. They're fasting for 10 days because they demanded that there be black students in their classes next year, and they would not stop their fast until they had a promise from their parents. Oh my God, it would turn this nation upside down, you see. We've been very successful in teaching kids that there's nothing they can do. It's the thing. I've been talking about medical care and medical treatment and what happens to people who are poor. And I'm going to do something now which may annoy somebody here if they're very strict pedagogue. How do you say that? Pedagogue. Because I'm not going to really talk about education for a minute now. I want you to know right now that what I'm talking about is not an abstract issue. It's not a school topic. You know how school can take almost any issue and neutralize it. You can study Malcolm X in public school in your Negro, what do they call this? The problems of democracy, right? You can study Malcolm X and it comes out like Tom Sawyer.